I know there's a group of people around who wanted to come and couldn't be here tonight, so we decided to video the whole thing. But please feel free to enjoy yourself, get some more food. It's not going to disturb me in the slightest. So, first of all, welcome to St. Peter's, especially for those of you who are not from this parish and are from around the diocese. We welcome you here. You're always welcome here. Who's here from St. Michael's? St. Michael's, St. Louis, and Sacred Heart? And where are you from? You're here? Oh, well, good to see you. And I see it. Are you from here too? Oh, great. Get a lot to see faces that you normally don't get to see often, and get to see some new ones and encounter some people that from around the diocese. That makes it one big happy family. So my background is actually in the field of physics. I graduated with a degree from Furman University, studying mostly optics, but I've always had a passion for science ever since I was young. And actually the dialogue between religion and science was something that I was always interested in. And when I finally entered into religious life and I did my thesis for my master's thesis, I actually focused on Georges Lemaître. Now, for those who don't know, Georges Lemaître is the father of the Big Bang Theory. And I wanted to dive deep into his life of how he kind of viewed the relationship between religion and science, because even then at that time, there was a lot of antagonism that was occurring in that area, particularly between sort of the atheistic scientists and also sort of the Catholic scientists that were there. However, if you look at the 20th century and then even beforehand, a lot of these scientists and even physicists even were deeply religious. Right? They had a sense of faith or a sense of mystery that what was present and what we could see, what we could touch, what we could analyze was not the only thing. That there was something deeper to the mystery of reality. I believe it was Heisenberg who said basically if you only dive partway into physics, that you will end up becoming an atheist. But if you sort of dive deeper, you will find a sense of mystery, that there's a sense of truth that's there. So Albert Einstein once said, "The pursuit of truth and beauty is a sphere of activity in which we are permitted to remain children all our lives." Now, I did this talk back in the fall around December, and one of the things I focused on was sort of not only just sort of the dialogue between religion and science, but also just sort of, I guess you could say, the philosophy of it all. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight as well, but also we wanted to welcome a lot of those throughout the diocese and those here in our parish who are catechists as well, those who are engaging students who are learning, who are discovering the truth, and how that can apply to our lives and our understanding as well. And how we can see our natural inclination and desire to know, that childlike sense of wonder, as a good, in which we are permitted to kind of actualize throughout our entire life. And so that was Albert Einstein's kind of thing. He saw that scientists in some ways were basically big kids. They had this sense of wonder and discovery. One of the first lines in my thesis said that the true scientist is like a little boy who keeps asking the question, why? Why? Why does this happen? What does this mean? How does it relate to everything that I have experienced thus far in my life? Which is kind of related to what Lemaître says, like any fellow human, he will still have to achieve the heart of a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. Thus, faith and reason unite in human activity without improper mixing or imaginary conflict. And we're going to dive deeper into his story of how that relates, because that's how he saw the two being connected. Because what ended up happening is you had this great division, and that the two, in terms of being bodies of knowledge, just could not connect with one another, could not talk to one another. And here's what happened. So the problem we have is like science versus religion. And what happened is you get this thing called the conflict thesis. You have science on one side and faith and religion on the other. And within this sphere is, I guess you could say, all the little discoveries, all the facts, all the knowledge of science that is there. So everything that we have observed with our own two eyes, or heard with our own two ears, or touched with our own two hands, or used some sort of measuring device to calculate and quantify some sort of detail or some sort of fact, versus what we know that comes from revelation. And this is something that is still true today. There's a growing belief, right, a narrative even, that science has ended the reign of religion. And what is often promoted is that the church, particularly the Catholic Church, and this actually began during the period of the Enlightenment, so the 19th, 18th centuries, is that human progress and advancement was being stifled by religion. That science was the new thing to come. So you have science, it kind of becomes the new religion. But yet, as I said in the beginning, some of our greatest heroes in science, especially during the period of modern science that we're talking about in the early 1900s, were deeply spiritual people. Like, there wasn't a sense of that this was all there was. Einstein was a Jew, but he talked about this sense of mystery, of diving into mystery. And if you look back even at the fathers of the church, early on in the early centuries of the Catholic Church, what you will find is this incomprehensible God, a God of mystery. So that even Einstein recognizes that even when he was doing science or discovering something, or when Heisenberg was discovering something, that there was a sense of mystery behind it all that science cannot quantify necessarily. And so the truth of the matter is that the story is often more complicated than science versus religion. That's exactly what we're led to believe. And this kind of happened with Francis Bacon, who he calls the father of modern science. And what he wanted to do was strip religion from politics and religion from science, because he saw religion as sort of like getting in the way. And this kind of began even before Francis Bacon arrived, even when we have someone like Isaac Newton, who was also deeply religious in several aspects. But what you notice is that there used to be something in the discovery of the natural world, of how people talked about it, is that there was something called four causes. We don't talk about four causes anymore. We talk about just sort of a cause and effect relationship. I push over the podium falls down. I'm the cause, the effect, the podium falls down. But there was this sort of like understanding that there was another type of cause, a cause of my own being, right? The cause of something that, why does this thing exist in the first place? And why do I exist? What causes me to be standing right here and causes this podium to be right here? And what causes this podium to be a podium versus this to be a human? I mean, because if you really want to be materialistic about it, right, the fact is, science will say, well, we're all just stardust. Well, if we're all just stardust, in the sense of this is how the natural world came about, through, I guess you could say, through the progression and evolution of matter, but this is still something different. A podium is meant to hold things, hold my papers, and I am a living, breathing organism. And I'm able to know and understand the world around me. It's not only do I have matter in me, I now have the capacity to understand what I am in fact made of, to even self-reflect on that. And so there was that division that kind of robbed that sense from science. So all you get now in science is just cause and effect relationships. And so you don't really have to be, I guess you could say, a believer to understand simple cause and effect relationships. When quantum mechanics first came around, there was a phrase that just said, shut up and calculate. Shut up and calculate. Don't worry about what the math says about the world. Just do the math because it demonstrates what we want. I can give an input and it gives me the correct output. And that's all cause and effect relationship is. The input that's in there and the output that comes out. I don't necessarily need to know what goes on underneath or care about it so much. And so we find that even beginning in the early 15th century with Isaac Newton moving forward into the Enlightenment period. And this all comes to a culmination with the social anthropologist James Frazer, who basically kind of saw religion in a way in the same line of magic. So if you think of like this ancient tribe, for example, this tribe that knows nothing of science. Well, if you notice in a lot of places, if you go in the dirt and you had a magnet, a powerful magnet, in some places there can be high concentrations of iron. Well, what that will do is grab some of that iron out of the dirt and put it onto the magnet. But what Frazer is trying to get at is like, oh, in the early civilizations, they didn't know what to call it. They didn't know it was science, so they called it magic. And so, well, then you get, in the term of magic, you get this sort of spiritual reality that kind of comes about. This is his understanding. And then out of that spiritual understanding, you have gods and people. And gods cause things to happen in nature that we don't quite yet understand. And so this is where he says, this is where religion comes in. And then you get this religion of Christianity that kind of imposes itself on the world. And then he sees science as finally freeing the world from the oppression of religion. So he sees it sort of as an evolution of belief. But here's the kicker. Now do you see where the conflict comes in? Is because science is becoming its own type of religion in that kind of mentality. And here's how the conflict happens, is that there's a principle that we believe in the world that says contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense, in the same way, at the same time. I cannot be both 6 feet tall and not 6 feet tall at the same time. I could be 4 feet tall maybe when I was 12 years old. I believe I was like 4'9" when I was 12. But now I am 5'10". But those are 2 different times, and that is allowed to happen, but not at the same time. I cannot be both 4'9" and 5'10", or 6 feet and not 6 feet at the same time. And so what people will look at is what does the Bible say? So you look at Genesis in the very beginning, and it has a very particular cosmology, or what we say is an understanding of the world. And so you have these 2 different types of contradictory facts. God created the human person in a literal 6 days. So on the 6th day, God created the person, plopped him right down there. Or humans emerging out of the millions of years of just sort of progress, of evolution, of development, or the fact that the universe came to be exactly as the story of creation states, or the universe started as with this just bang, right? This big bang or this expansion. So if you can only describe something as true if they're trying to say the same thing in the same way, only one of these can be true. Or the other has to be false. And so what ends up happening is you have these two different bodies of facts, and the issue is we're actually kind of looking at religion, if you look at it that way, or how Genesis kind of brings itself about, right, or what it kind of unveils for us, is that it leads to a particular biblical literalism. And that's actually what happened is scientific literalism in the early 20th century and the late 21st century kind of led to this biblical kind of literalism. Now, here's the religious attitude that kind of goes along with science. Every truth claim must be subject to scientific validation. I call this, an a priori truth. And what that means is that I can't validate it. I can't put it under a microscope. Like, how do I prove that every truth must be subject to scientific validation? So I say, this is true. Well, how do I test that it's true? There's no way to test it. I have to basically take it kind of on good faith. It is known independently of any particular evidence or experience. An example of an a priori truth would be what I was saying about the principle of non-contradiction. But it kind of defeats itself, because if every truth claim must be subject to scientific validation, and I can't scientifically validate that claim, it doesn't work anymore. I can't put that statement to the test. But it's what sort of the scientific community can kind of hold on to when trying to dismiss religion, because it wants to put religion under a microscope, or faith under a microscope. So as I said, you have these two things of faith and science being bodies of knowledge, these two contents of facts that are there. And then you have the rise of biblical literalism and scientific literalism. And here's the kicker, is that often scientists forget that theories, while based on evidence that we have experienced, are themselves models or descriptions of the natural world. Right? They're supposed to help us understand what is true, but theories change and evolve over periods of time. And we call this inference to best explanation. So for the same thing like with quantum mechanics, we don't know exactly how it works. It just works. Just shut up and calculate. But it's the best explanation we have. It fits the model. Because I just put it over this input and it gives me the correct output. And I may have certain pieces of evidence that kind of lend itself to be true, but quantum mechanics is really strange. You have two particles at very large distances interacting with one another. How on earth do they communicate? And by the way, Einstein hated that. He called it spooky action at a distance. But we can't hold on to theories as actual facts, or that they aren't subject to change, but that when we have a theory, there's a sense of even kind of a religious belief, to use that term loosely, of a trust that this is actually going to lead us to the truth. And it may be completely correct, and it may be completely wrong. So let's talk about myths. I want to kind of shape the idea of myth, because this is actually going to help us in understand Lemaître's position as uniting faith and science in the human person, and not just as two separate bodies of facts. But a myth is a story or a narrative, simply. We often think about myth as this sort of, as just a false narrative. But we can even talk about the story of Genesis in the very beginning of how creation was made as a myth. In the good sense of the word. that is trying to communicate something that is true about creation. This is sort of the narrative of how the ancient Israelites viewed Scripture. So if you wanted to take Jewish cosmology as literal fact, you would go up into the sky and you would find a few things. You would find holes poking through the sky where the rains of heaven would just kind of fall down because there was an ocean in the heavens. And then not only that, the stars weren't light years away, separated by great distances. They were stuck on this dome called the firmament. And they were just stuck on the sphere. And you know what? The sphere rotated around the earth. And then even here, the earth has pillars. It's like if you see a picture now of the earth, like I don't see an infinite amount of turtles, where the earth kind of sits down on it, or that there's giant pillars of it. So if you kind of saw versus the scientific fact of what we kind of see with the picture versus what this presents, you now see that there's a difference. That either one is true and one is false, but does that negate what faith is trying to tell us? Absolutely not. Because what Lemaître would be saying is that there's something about the story of Genesis that isn't trying to communicate scientific fact to us, that God is not going to rob us of that joy and that awe and that wonder of discovery of natural truths that we would be able to find on our own, but that God gives us a sense of revelation of what we could not understand from natural truths. And what does Genesis kind of give us but a different interpretation of the myths that are around ancient Israel at the time? So in the near Middle East, particularly in Babylon, if you want to look at how the story of creation happens, it is out of great violence and out of war. It is out of struggle. It is something that we often hear called as a Chaos-Kampf or Chaos-Kampf. It's German, that just means a struggle out of chaos. Right? You think of the great Greek myth of like the Titans battling out, right? How chaos is the origin and then order is brought forth by this great war. But that's not at all how Scripture depicts creation coming about. It's God draws forth creation out of the waters of chaos. It's not a war. It's God draws it forth as if God has command already over the force of chaos, and creation comes to be. Let there be light. But we can kind of still see how the story of the church is against religion. Even today, when we hear often people talk about just sort of the story of Galileo. And here's just in simplistic terms, is Galileo is the hero of the age of science, and the church are the villains. Like Robert Bellarmine, the Pope, the church as a whole is this villainous sort of group that is antagonizing and stopping the progression of scientific discovery and scientific truths from really furthering on. But what most people don't know is that there were a couple Jesuit scientists that actually observed the same thing that Galileo observed in 1611 about Jupiter and its moons. Now here's why the church, in some sense, was a little hesitant about it. We still didn't understand everything we know about science or stars. We still believed that the stars were kind of stuck on the sky in a dome called the celestial sphere, which kind of changed sort of our mentality of it. But if the sun was truly the center of the universe, or the heliocentric model that Galileo was proposing, they said you would see a shift. You would see a shift in the movement and the observance of the background stars and the moons, but they didn't see it. Why? Because they didn't understand that the stars in the background were light years away. Now, there's something called a parallax, and if you want to hold your finger up, and if you close one eye and then shift it over, and just focus on one point in the background, you'll notice your finger shift relative to where the background is. That's what they were hoping to see. And they did not detect that because they had a different worldview. Their model, their theory, could not account for that. Just like I said, that theories are models or inferences to best explanation, that they don't always fit reality, and theories are tested by more and more evidence to the contrary. That was a theory, and it's kind of proved itself to be falsified. But that's kind of what happened in the church. You kind of get Galileo to be seen as this hero of science, and the church is the villain. In reality, it's much more complicated. In fact, Galileo was just as stubborn in some sense as the church was stubborn. They both kind of made flaws and errors and did not kind of give leeway to one another. But here's kind of where we can kind of enter into what science really is, as separate from what we often want to think about it in terms of just a body of facts versus a body of factual knowledge, versus a biblical literalism versus a scientific or a scientistic literalism. So science comes from the Latin scientia, and the verb is scire, which means to know. So why do we want to know? Well, we believe that the world is knowable and that there is something truthful about the world. So Lemaître, Einstein, all believe that the pursuit of truth, well, what does it say? Is that reality is real. Like there's something real about Mike over here. There's something real about this podium, there's real about this chair. There's something real about the world that I know and I come to know through my senses. And then I actually trust my senses in some way. And for the most part, I can kind of come to know what is real about the world and that I have an intellect. Well, that means that if I have an intellect, that means there's something out there in the world that is intelligible, that I can know something about it. And we know intelligible things by the habit of science. And when I mean by habit, I don't mean this little nice white dress I'm wearing up here today, or just something that we actually do over and over again, like we talk about the habits of making our bed, or the habits of brushing our teeth, or the habits that we just got into over the years. But a habit just comes from the verb to have, and it means like to possess something. So it's a quality of my own being in some sense, to want to know, to desire to know, that we are made to know and love the truth. And that truth ends in God. But it's something that I possess. The same thing with faith and religion, which we often kind of equate them together as nouns. But like when we think of like the virtue of charity, we talk about charity as a virtue, but we also talk about charity as a noun, like I gave to charity, or faith as a noun. But faith is that action, that habit of which I exercise my total trust in God, right? That habit or exercise that I know that something is true beyond my own mental capacity to know through my senses. So faith is an infused theological virtue, and it kind of has different meanings depending on sort of the spiritual depth that we dive into. I can believe that God exists. I know that there's something true, that there's something that exists that is beyond my comprehension that I call God, that is the source of all that is. Well, then I kind of dive deeper and say catered Deo, which I believe not only does God exist, but I believe that this God is trustworthy, that what he says is true. So I open up Scripture and I hear his word. I understand that not only does this God exist and ground me and cause me to be and loves me into being, but there's a sense in which he's communicating to me. And lastly, catered in Deum, which means I have this action of faith, of a faith that is alive in God. That it means I believe into God is kind of the actual sort of it has a directionality to it. It's like I dive right into the life of God. That I thrust myself totally in trust that God is for me, that God is totally for my good and for my benefit, and that I live totally in love of God and neighbor. Religion is a slightly different from faith. It's more related to justice, which talks about that action of like giving what is God's due. Like, what does God ask? Well, God asks us to love him, to adore him. And to adore him is not for his benefit, but for ours. Because when we adore, we recognize our own purpose for being. Because to adore him is that I find that my own purpose is to know and to love. To know and to love are kind of two sides of the same coin. And so, in a sense, religion comes from this Latin verb to religere, which means to rebind. It's to rebind in relationship. So if you talk to, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who went back in the Middle Ages and went to Paris in 1271 and asked Thomas and says, Tommy, tell me, what is your religion? He wouldn't say, I'm Catholic. He wouldn't say, there wasn't the sense of sort of Protestant denominations back then. He wouldn't even just say he's Christian as his religion. He says, my religion is the Eucharist. It is my act of binding myself to God. But if you look at what is happening then, is where does science and religion and faith really meet but in the activity of the person. It goes back to what Lemaître was saying is that science and religion mix without any sort of mixture or imaginary conflict in human activity, not necessarily cognitively, because of what has happened in modern science of just stripping the sense of what we say is of God as the ground of all that is, and just looking at cause and effect. Because I don't need God to understand cause and effect. I mean, in one way you do. But I can observe and quantify things and tell you exactly what happens without having to tell you the God story. So this is what James Fraser was kind of talking about, is that you had those early ancient civilizations that believed in magic that was really just science and they didn't know it. And that, you have now these gods who take place to understand or to understand the world, and that they cause natural phenomena. So like the God of the rain, the God of the earth. And then you have the Judeo-Christian God who is the God of everything. So you don't need all these smaller little gods. You just have one God now. But it kind of takes the place of it. Now, what happens then if science comes in and says, I can find you a natural explanation that doesn't require inserting God in the place? Well, then I have just made God a natural cause. Remember how I was talking about the four causes in a sense, the very beginning is science doesn't care about the others anymore, two of them, what we say are final or formal cause. Formal cause is what gives the thing or makes this thing and this thing different. Or final cause is like what is the purpose of a thing. But the fact that you and I, as all things in the end, are made for God. All things belong to God. But God is not like a first domino. Because if he was, in the same sense that I understand of like what caused the universe to be, and I found a natural explanation for it, well, then I can just disprove God. But if God was a different type of cause, God loves you into being, God causes you to be, God causes other causes to be. And then another phrase of what God is called the cause of causes. So I can say at the same time, God made the Big Bang. And at the same time, propose a natural cause of what that was. That at some point at the very beginnings of the universe, right, all matter, all energy, all of time and space was compressed into a singular, small, infinitesimally small point that we call a singularity. But here is the funny thing. People say, well, there's nothing there. There's no matter, there's no space. It's nothing. Not from a Christian standpoint. That's actually something. The fact that I'm saying that all matter and energy is compressed into a small point is not nothing. It's something. And yet we believe God creates out of nothing. So what brought the something there? And yet we can't even answer that, and science can't even answer that, because you can't go back before a time where there was no time. But God is not to be put into a natural sort of solution to find a solution for our own sort of natural problems. But God sort of undergirds everything, is underneath everything, and causes all things to be. So this is Monsignor Georges Lemaître. He was born in the late 19th century. He's the father of the Big Bang Theory. Most people think he was a Jesuit scientist. He was actually not. He was a Belgian priest. He was deeply spiritual. Every year, he took a 10-day silent retreat. He belonged to a religious congregation known as the Friends of Jesus. And this was made by Cardinal Mercier in Belgium to kind of create a spiritual elite force of priests. That was sort of the predominating sort of thrust that Lemaître kind of got thrown into. And one of his deeply held beliefs is that the pursuit of truth is the highest human activity. So again, he was born in 1894. And when he was 9 years old, he says, I want to be a priest and a scientist. I want to know the truth from the standpoint of science, and I want to know the truth from the standpoint of revelation. And he was trained by Jesuits as a boy, which is probably why a lot of people think he was a Jesuit. But this is actually where he started developing his own vocation as a priest and as a scientist, and his own sort of view of how they worked together. So remember how I said that you kind of had two bodies of knowledge, like of what Genesis says directly and literally versus what science says. And so Lemaître did the same thing, opened up Genesis and started looking at just sort of the coincidences, right? Oh, this is true. Therefore, this whole thing must be true. Therefore, then now I have to discover this scientifically. And this is where his Jesuit professor kind of told him that if there was any sort of historical truth of science found in Scripture, it is either coincidence. Actually, he said the professor said coincidence, but I would even say providential. Dare say providential that it was, but that the Scriptures weren't necessarily to give you scientific fact. They were there to give you the truth and knowledge of God that we otherwise wouldn't have by natural means. And some of his biggest influences that continue to help shape his own thought and belief were certainly Aquinas. Aquinas was the one who kind of really developed this understanding of God as existence. So you and I, we would say, are beings or things, right? I'm a being, this is a being, but then I notice that, like, why does that thing exist? Why do I exist? Why does this thing exist? If I got really mad and destroyed that chair, does that no longer exist? And I can rebuild that chair and then it exists again. So I know that things come to be and things cease to be, yet the common thing is that things exist. And so there's a sense in which Aquinas says God is to be. So God is is not a being as such as like you and I are, but in a way God is like more like a verb than a noun. His action is to cause things to be, to love things into being, to create. Sir Arthur Eddington was one of his thesis directors back when he studied at Cambridge, and Lemaître had quite a few conversations with Einstein back in the day. In fact, Einstein at first did not like Lemaître's theory on the Big Bang, because Einstein liked a beautiful, simple universe, an eternal universe, a static universe. Nothing changed, nothing came in, nothing came out, nothing was fluctuating. And here comes Lemaître proposing, hey, guess what? Universe started as a very, 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 very small point and is now as big as it is now. And Einstein hated that, which he later said it was one of the most beautiful theories he ever heard. Lemaître was also, after his days in college, he enrolled in the First World War, with the Great War. And he wrote a book, or really an essay, called The First Three Words of God, Let There Be Light, which in French would only be 3 words. But the first 3 words of God, let there be light. And he had this belief that he still struggled, and thinking that somehow that faith in science, that what I could know through Scripture was directly related to science. And he says, let there be light. Well, he says, well, at the beginning of the universe, he's already thinking of his own theory at this point of like, what was at the very beginning of the universe? Which is radiation or high energy, which is what we think now happened at the Big Bang, is that you compress all of matter, right, into an infinitely condensed state, and it's just this highly condensed energy, which is radiation. So he says, let there be light. There we go. Here is proof that at the beginning of the universe, there was radiation. That's how the universe started. But at the meantime, as he was writing this paper, he sent it off to a theologian named Leon Bloy. And Leon looked at it and he says, I think you need to understand theology a little bit more, so you can better understand the relationship between faith and science. And he also didn't understand the limits of science in some way. So as a cosmologist and as a physicist, he went and studied with Eddington. And if you look at one of Eddington's essays on the natural world, Eddington talks about each and every term of science is described in terms of one another. So how do I describe something without relating it to something else that I already know? So if I want to talk about space, well, I can't have a concept of space unless I have like things in the space that kind of give me an aspect of like where things are. So then I have to talk about space in terms of matter, but if I wanted to talk about matter, I have to talk about that it occupies space. So they're kind of interlocked. And so Eddington says physics is a self-contained domain, meaning that all scientific terms are just defined by one another. So if you wanted to ask a God question, like what is outside of what is physical, physics or even science can't get out there. It's not made to get out there. But there is one thing that I would like to say. We already said that Einstein believed in a beautiful, simple, and intelligible universe. But there's one thing that Lemaître held very deeply true, is the sense of wonder and awe. Because I really think that really where religion and science connect is the sense of the mystical, the spiritual, the mysterious. That God is a hidden God even at the beginning of creation. That's Lemaître's own words. God is a hidden God even at the beginning of creation. He says it leaves the atheist to disregard any metaphysical reality. And so what I mean by metaphysical, I mean something that causes things to be. So I can, instead of looking at just cause and effect relationships, I can just like, why is this here? Why am I here? But he says it gives the faithful person an edge because he knows where that truth belongs. And so he says faith and science, right? Faith and reason unite in God as truth, but they follow their own unique path. And so he would say, I follow two paths to truth, uniting in God. But God never left science. It's just God was underneath it. God was hidden. If you really kind of want to understand kind of how deeply spiritual this man was, here's a page of his journal. On the top is his scientific writings. On the bottom is his spiritual notes, particularly on a Flemish mystic named John von Ruysbroek. Now here's how he unified faith and science together. Faith supernaturalizes, all right, the scientists or his highest and lowest activities. So your highest activities, your pursuit of truth, right? He says the highest activity is the pursuit of truth. And the lowest activities, well, it's like getting up out of bed. Like just the simple, ordinary things, faith supernaturalizes. It gives us a reason. It gives us a purpose. So he says the unity between science and faith is not joined in concept, but in activity. And I think he gets that specifically from Ruysbroek. Because Ruysbroek was writing during a period of time in the medieval ages, in about the 14th century, during a time when people believed that they could basically become super mystics, unite themselves totally to God by just passive meditation, contemplation. Now, there's nothing wrong with contemplation, but Ruysbroek said there's something wrong here because a part of the Christian life is charity. Like the demonstration, the actualization, the activity of charity is crucial to the Christian life. So you cannot take one without the other. So he blends them together and sees God's activity, right? God is a Trinity. God is constantly enjoying himself. God knows and loves us, just as God knows and loves himself. And out of that love comes forth and bursts forth sort of this creation, because he desires to share that joy, that enjoyment with others. But that enjoyment is a type of what we say is rest. You know, when I get to be with my best friend, for example, sometimes we don't even need words to be with our friends. We just are. We can just be and observe, just to be present too. And yet at the same time, this God is active in creation. So here he says, the Christian researcher knows that his faith supernaturalizes both his highest and lowest of activities. He remains God's child even when he peers through his microscope, and in his morning prayers, he puts every daily activity under his heavenly Father's protection. So there's a sense in which that childlike wonder and awe, that mystery, that hidden God that the mystics so often hit on, is really what drives Lemaître's desire to know the world, to discover and understand. And those who are teachers and catechists understand that the mind of a child, a young child, is constantly out in the world seeking to discover every aspect about it. Right? They're, especially very little children, right? Toddlers, babies, are putting everything in their hands and mouth because they're trying to gain access to that sensory input to know and understand the world around them, to see themselves as being distinct from the world. And so it is in the sort of activity of knowing, but an activity of knowing with the aid of faith, that we see that God is mystery underneath it all. That this God is hidden. That God is incomprehensible. So that even when I say God is love or God is strong, the only concept I have of those things are in terms of what I have come to experience in a human way. And so what does that mean? That God is love, but not like the love that I know. In fact, it's infinitely better than the love that I have received. Or God is strong, but not in the kind of strength that I know or that I'm used to, but infinitely more so. And so faith kind of gives us that security and that strength to know that there is a mystery behind it all. That every action of discovery that we undertake in this world leads us to truth, to the one who is God. And so I can understand God through revelation, through the manifestation of the incarnate Word, God coming to us in the flesh, and what he reveals to us, and how he desires to be in relationship to us. And I can come to understand and know God through the world that is given. Because my faith says that he not only made it, but he underlies it. He is the mystery that sustains it. And here he says, he knows that all that has been made by God. But he also knows that nowhere did God take his creature's place. The omnipresent divine action is everywhere essentially hidden. It is forever out of the question to reduce the supreme being to the level of a scientific hypothesis. Divine revelation never taught us what we could have found out by ourselves, at least when these natural truths are not necessary to understand the supernatural truth. And here he says, sort of like, must achieve the heart of a little child. I believe I showed part of that quote. But that, like, each and every one of us has to have that sense of embracing that childlike sense of trust in God, placing everything underneath God's care, but also that childlike sense of wonder and awe that everything that we do is under our Heavenly Father's protection. Thus, faith and reason unite in human activity without improper mixing or imaginary conflict. So in conclusion, this is where I see Lemaître's two paths of truth sort of uniting, is in the convergence of this sort of spiritual exercise of understanding that God, who we come to understand through revelation, is also a mystery. And the natural truths that we discover are still mysterious to us. That sometimes the best we can do are propose theories and models that lead us closer to the truth. But the joy and understanding of it all, the joy of understanding, comes from knowing that there is a great mystery that kind of laid it out before us. That there are things that are true, that the reason why there are things that are knowable and truthful is because I believe that there is a being who is truth itself, who causes all things to be. And so we come to this end where perhaps the best way to come into contact with God as a scientist, as a lover of the natural world, is to constantly stand enwrapped in awe and beauty as Einstein and as Lemaître had loved and desired for their life. And that's truly what makes a scientist, the one who refuses to stop asking why, who constantly asks why, who wants to answer and find the mystery and to get lost in it. And that's really what makes a scientist. But you know what? That's what also makes us faithful as well, to kind of get wrapped in the mystery of who God is, who's infinitely more than we are, who's infinitely more than we could ever know. And it's in a way, our purpose as people, as faithful people, to dive right into mystery. Yep, that's it. I'm just reversing back to the beginning. Any questions? Jackson? You sure? I will print it out for you. I will have it on Sunday. He just is so he was she was asking what would it do some type of good discovering the Big Bang Theory?
Yes, what was his motivation for cultivating this theory? Hope that it would do good for
I think one of the things that he kind of noticed, well, this was before he even worked out, um, or they even discovered that the universe was actually expanding. So Hubble is often the one that is sort of given sort of that honor of saying that the universe was expanding. But that law has since been changed to the Hubble-Lemaître law. But Lemaître really just wanted to be a scientist, his theory to be judged strictly under scientific terms. And in the sense of doing good, I think was it going to be something that he was going to add that should add to our faith or take away from it? This is what he says. Let me see if I can find the quote. He basically says that the knowledge of microbes will not impede or enhance one's activity or knowledge of the Supreme Being, yet he still has to be like a little child, placing everything under his Heavenly Father's care. So what he's basically saying is that even discovering the Big Bang Theory, it's neither good or bad. I mean, it is a good, but it's not like he was doing it directly to, hey, here's why you should believe, for example. In fact, that's actually one of the problems he ran into was an atheist is actually the one who coined the Big Bang term, because he thought that Lemaître was trying to enforce his faith into the scientific realm. So it's like you're just trying to force this beginning that was there. And in fact, Pope Pius XII, who Lemaître was good friends with, said, "We have found the fiat lux. We have found the let there be light." And Lemaître was beside himself. He's like, "Oh, you can't say that." Because what if you found a different explanation for it, and it was another natural explanation, another cause, then that would just give the atheist more of a reason to say, I don't need God anymore. And that's what the God in the gaps point was for. But in terms of Lemaître's sort of, was it going to do good for faith or harm the faith? It was just, I want to be a scientist. He knew it was uniting his own personal activity of faith. That's where it really would impact. But it wasn't necessarily to draw people to faith.
You talk a little bit about dark energy and dark matter.
Okay. So dark energy and dark matter. So this is a proposed theory. So no one really knows how this actually works. But there's a certain amount of visible light that detectors can really sort of get. So all matter emits radiation of some sort in space. And you can kind of calculate based off of that amount of radiation how much matter the universe occupies. Well, matter bends space, right? Supposedly, right? So that's what Einstein's theory of general relativity states, is that this matter would bend space. And so the stars, the galaxies, should behave in a particular way. However, there's not enough mass in the universe that is accounted for just by looking at the radiative spectrum, sort of looking at the radiation of the light that is being emitted from matter. So we call it dark matter because we can't see it. So we give it this name because it makes the calculation work. So we have no proof of it necessarily, but we know how the universe acts, and we just put this term in there to account for how the universe actually behaves and to account for whatever this missing mass is. Dark energy is somewhat different. So even with the amount of mass that is in the universe, you would expect the universe to come to a point where it can expand no further. So basically from the Big Bang, there's energy release, and it's propelling galaxies and dust and matter and stretching space. And space is getting more and more enlarged. Now, it should reach to a point where the matter just kind of like stops and it contracts back in and collapses. However, we see that the universe is actually not only expanding, but is actually accelerating. So what causes something to accelerate but like an outside force? So what we understand of the laws of physics is, how do you make something move faster? Well, I push on it longer. Or if I, so if I really push on something really, really hard and sustain that, it would start accelerating, getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. Well, that's a type of input of energy. So dark energy is this unknown force that we don't quite yet understand, that is really propelling the universe to expand, or what we measure to be expanding.
How would you describe that in terms of God? Can you,
I mean, this would be the thing, is sort of like in terms of and like how would that relate to God? See, this is where like even Lemaître would be kind of, if you wouldn't want to insert like God into it, like this is what God is doing necessarily, or like to derive any meaning from it. Because if you try to do that, and I can discover another kind of cause for it, then I rob God of something. So what we can understand is, like, did God providentially create the universe to be as it is this way? Did God cause energy to be, or dark energy to be? Or the fact that, did God cause dark matter to be? All these things are interplaying, is that God is hidden underneath it all. But that is not necessarily that God is, pulling on things. God allows these things, or created these things to be, to cause the world of the universe to go forth in progression according to his plan. Any
So God is infinite.
God is infinite, and God is infinite. Any kind of descriptor of what we can say is inadequate to explain of who God is, and that's kind of in the way the beauty of faith is that we have a God who is infinite, yet becomes finite, who reveals himself to us, and that's the kind of the great mystery of our faith. Is that we have a transcendent God who comes close to us, reveals himself to us.
The way I understand it is that dark matter is just supposed to science put things that they can't understand.
Exactly. No, that's very true. There's not really any physical kind of evidence for it, other than the fact that there needs to be a term there to make this whole thing work. Even quantum mechanics is still strange, and people are still proposing theories of how this works. The fact that, can you look at something and it causes something to exist? That doesn't happen. But quantum mechanics says it does. It doesn't make sense. That the observer causes something to happen in the description of the behavior of a very tiny, fast-moving particle. It shouldn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And it goes against every sensibility. So people are still trying to figure out, like, how does this actually work? And there are more and more theories being proposed. But the math works. The model works. And in some ways, that's all the scientists care about. Do I have the correct input? And does it give me the correct output? And that's what matters. To them at least. It doesn't mean that they're right. Any other questions? So I think in a lot of ways they go back to that narrative that I was telling you about. So the idea of magic to religion to science, and that science is really just it can explain everything that I need to know. So let's like do something. We talk about spirituality or spiritual exercises. So we talk about prayer, things like this. If I go to a psychologist or a neurologist, they're going to hook me up to different monitors, and they're going to reduce prayer, meditation, contemplation. They're going to reduce basically, things that we talk about, even in the terms of the church of like spiritual warfare, to just sort of neurological causes. And the church says, like, is it something spiritual or is it something neurological or psychological? And in reality is the church accepts both. In fact, one can cause the other, because we talk about ourselves as being a union of both matter and spirit. But it becomes this reductionistic sort of sense where I can just reduce everything to the materialistic. Correct. So there's a this is not always the right answer, but it's our beloved Franciscan brother William of Ockham. He kind of believed in the sense of like what is the most correct answer is often the most simple answer. So if I don't need a God to explain everything, then I'm just going to go with the most simple answer. If I don't need a spiritual side of things to explain it, then I'm just going to go with this simple answer. And the truth is that even when science can't explain it, they're going to go back to that narrative and says, well, we just haven't discovered that natural cause yet. So they're still going to deny it in hopes that they find a natural relationship to it. They may not find it. There's going to be a lot of things that we're going to leave behind that we don't know. But they're going to be hopeful that there is one, which if you really think about it, is a type of religious attitude. That type of, I place my trust and my faith in science than in a God. So science becomes their God, in a way. But that's how they can kind of keep negating that fact, even if they don't understand it. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming. This has been a wonderful experience to have all of you here. You honor me, and thank you for being here at St. Peter's. You're always welcome here. And please go and take home some food. So God bless you all. Thank you very much.